For 300 years, swordsmen in Japan trained for a fight that lasted less than 1 second, a single draw of the blade. The winner was decided before either man moved, in the space between seeing an opening and cutting it. Miss that instant, and you were already dead. This is the story of a man who lived his whole life missing it, a menu he could never order from, a job he could never quit, and of the old swordsman whose method, severe and unforgiving, stripped the paralysis out of him in 6 weeks. Kenji Okamura was 34, and he had stood in the doorway of his own life for as long as he could remember. He worked in Osaka, at a mid-sized logistics firm, in a job taken 6 years earlier, because it was the first offer to arrive, and waiting felt unbearable. He told himself it was temporary. He had told himself that for 6 years. At the convenience store, he could spend 4 minutes choosing between 2 nearly identical rice balls. At work, he drafted 3 versions of every email and sent none of them for hours. A folder on his laptop called Apartment Options held 11 listings in 3 cities. He had opened it every week for 2 years and signed a lease on none of them. Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe, because tomorrow, we've got something special lined up just for you. His girlfriend, Aya, had asked him in March whether he wanted to move in together. It was July now. He still hadn't answered her. Not with a no, just silence stretched long enough that the silence became the answer, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so out loud. Kenji wasn't stupid. That was the part that confused people who knew him. He read widely. He thought carefully. He could lay out the pros and cons of almost any choice in a way that impressed his coworkers in meetings. But laying out the pros and cons was as far as he ever got. He had turned thinking into a hiding place. As long as he was still weighing something, he never had to be wrong about it. His manager, a blunt woman named Fujita, called him into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. She had asked him 3 weeks earlier to choose between 2 vendors for a new shipping contract. Both were solid. Either would have worked. Kenji had built a spreadsheet with 40 rows of comparison data and still hadn't picked one. "I signed with the other vendor an hour ago," she told him. "Not because their numbers were better. Yours were fine. I signed with them because they answered my email in 10 minutes, and you took 3 weeks to answer mine." Kenji started to explain that he'd wanted to be thorough. "Being thorough and being paralyzed look the same from the outside, Okamura," she said. "Nobody promotes a man they can't get an answer out of." He left the office that evening and walked for a long time without any destination in mind, which was, if he was honest, the only kind of walking he still knew how to do. Somewhere past the train station, down a narrow side street he'd never noticed before, he saw a small shop with no sign, just a single sword resting in a glass case in the window, lit from below. He went in without deciding to. The shop was 1 room, dim, smelling of oil and old wood. Blades hung on the far wall, some finished, some still rough steel. Behind a low table sat an old man sharpening a knife with slow, even strokes, not looking up. "We're closed," the man said. Kenji didn't move. The door was open. The old man set the knife down. He looked to be somewhere past 70, thin through the shoulders but with hands that moved like they'd never once fumbled anything. His name, Kenji would later learn, was Sugimoto Ren, and he had trained for over 40 years in iaido, the art of drawing the sword. He studied Kenji for a moment. "You've been standing outside my window for 6 minutes. I watched you decide to come in 4 separate times before you did it." Kenji felt his face go hot. "I was thinking about it. You were doing the opposite of thinking. Thinking has an end. What you were doing does not." Sugimoto stood and walked to the case, lifted the sword out with both hands, and set it on the table between them. "Do you know what iaido is? Sword fighting?" "No." Sugimoto's voice didn't rise, but something in it flattened. "Sword fighting is what happens after the failure. Iaido is everything before it. We do not train to swing a blade well. Any fool can swing a blade. We train for one single motion, the draw, from sheath to cut, in less time than it takes you to blink. That is the entire art. Everything else is a man who has already lost. He drew the sword from its sheath in one motion, so fast, Kenji barely registered it had happened until the blade was resting flat across the old man's palm, catching the light. In a real duel, Sugimoto said, there is one moment where an opening exists. It is there, and then it is gone, whether you took it or not. A swordsman who is still calculating when that moment arrives is already a corpse. Not because he calculated wrong, because he calculated at all. Kenji looked at the blade, then at the old man. I'm not a swordsman. No, Sugimoto agreed, sliding the sword back into its sheath. You're something worse. You're a man who has never once drawn. The words landed harder than they should have from a stranger. Kenji thought of the 11 apartment listings, the unsent emails, the lost contract, Aya's question sitting unanswered for 4 months, like an object he kept walking around instead of picking up. Teach me, he said, before he'd finished deciding to say it. Sugimoto almost smiled. That's the first honest thing you've done since you walked in. Sugimoto told Kenji to come back the following evening, and the one after that, and Kenji did, arriving straight from work, still in his office clothes. The first lesson had nothing to do with swords. Sugimoto set 2 bowls of rice in front of Kenji, identical in every way he could see. Pick one. Kenji looked at them for a long moment, searching for some difference that would justify the delay. You're looking for a reason, Sugimoto said. There isn't one. They're the same bowl. Your hesitation isn't caution. It's a habit with nowhere useful to spend itself. What if I pick wrong? They're identical bowls of rice. Okamura. There is no wrong. Kenji picked the left one. It took him nearly 30 seconds. Sugimoto shook his head slowly. 30 seconds for a decision with 0 consequence. Do you understand now why the contract took you 3 weeks? You don't have a decision-making problem. You have a decision-avoiding reflex, and it fires whether the stakes are enormous or nothing at all. He picked up a wooden practice sword from the rack and held it out. A blade has no opinion about the cut. It doesn't ask whether the cut is correct. It doesn't revisit the cut after it's made. The sword's only obligation is to move when the hand moves. You've spent your whole life being the opposite of a blade. You gather opinions about every cut before you'll allow your hand to move at all. And by the time you've gathered enough, the target isn't there anymore. So I just act without thinking. No. Sugimoto's tone sharpened. That's the mistake every impatient student makes when I say this, and it's the wrong lesson entirely. Recklessness isn't the cure for paralysis. It's paralysis wearing a different coat. A swordsman who draws without training is as dead as one who never draws at all. The draw looks instant. It isn't. It's built from years of narrowing what you'd ever need to consider in the first place, so that when the moment comes, there's nothing left to weigh. He set the wooden sword down. You don't need more courage, Okamura. You need less to think about. Tomorrow, we start building that. On the 3rd evening, Sugimoto laid out the method and gave it a name. Sokudan, the instant decision. 3 parts, each repeated back before moving on. Most decisions fail months before the moment, because you never learned what you actually value, Sugimoto said. He had Kenji write down, on one sheet, 5 things that mattered enough to guide a decision on their own. Working criteria, nothing that merely sounded impressive. Kenji wrote and crossed out for 2 evenings. What he landed on was short. Build something of his own before 40. Keep his word once given. Spend money on freedom rather than comfort. Choose people who answered him honestly. Protect his time from anything that postponed his life instead of building it. This is your edge, Sugimoto said, holding up the paper. A dull blade hesitates against everything. A sharp one already knows it will cut. Every decision gets checked against this list first. Most will answer themselves. Then came the clock. Small decisions, 60 seconds. What to eat, which train, which email first. Medium decisions, the kind that touch one item on the list, 1 hour. Large ones, a job, an apartment, a relationship, 24 hours once the sheet had been checked. You'll want more time, everyone does. But time past this point only piles noise on an answer you reached in the first 10 minutes and buried under research you didn't need. Kenji thought of the 11 apartments. He had known which one he wanted from the first viewing. He had refused to act on knowing it. The last part Sugimoto repeated most. A swordsman does not stop mid-motion to ask whether the cut was right. You may adjust your next decision. You may never reopen this one. When you catch yourself replaying a finished choice, say the cut is finished and turn to what comes next. What if the cut was wrong? Then you'll know soon, and the next cut will be better. A swordsman who stands over his last cut gets killed by the next opponent, who is already moving. Regret isn't wisdom, Okamura. And it's hesitation, dressed up and looking backward. 2 weeks in, Sugimoto assigned homework. Answer Aya tonight. 60 seconds after you read this, not 60 minutes. Check the sheet, then draw. Kenji stood in his kitchen long enough to feel the old pull toward drafting 3 versions. Then he remembered the paper. Choose people who answer honestly. Build something of his own. He had known his answer for months. He called, instead of texting, said yes, before he planned the phrasing, and the conversation was easier than 4 months of silence had ever been. The apartment took 11 minutes, once he stopped researching and started deciding. He signed the lease that week and never wondered afterward. At work, Fujita noticed before he said a word. An email answered in 4 minutes, a vendor recommendation without caveats. She said nothing. She just began copying him on decisions she had never trusted him with before. 6 weeks after Kenji first walked into the shop, Sugimoto handed him a finished blade, not the practice sword, an actual one, plain-handled and unremarkable to look at. "This isn't a gift," the old man said. "It's a mirror. Look at it, and tell me what you see." Kenji turned it over in his hands. "A sword. Wrong answer, but an honest one, so I'll let it go." Sugimoto sat back down at his low table. "What you're holding is the end result of 1,000 decisions the smith made, without hesitating over any of them, because he'd already done the harder work long before he picked up the hammer. He knew his steel. He knew his fire. He knew exactly what the finished blade needed to do. Everything after that was just the drawing out of something already decided." Kenji understood, finally, what the 6 weeks had actually rebuilt in him. It was never about moving faster for its own sake. It was that he'd spent years mistaking indecision for care, when in fact, the two had nothing to do with each other. Care lived in the sheet of paper, in the criteria he'd forced himself to actually name, instead of endlessly implying. Speed only worked because the care had already happened somewhere earlier, out of sight, before the moment ever arrived. He thought about how much of his life he'd spent standing in doorways, believing the standing itself was a form of diligence. It had never been diligence. It had been a way of avoiding the risk of being wrong in front of anyone, including himself. Choice paralysis, he realized, wasn't a flaw in his intelligence. If anything, it had fed on his intelligence, using his ability to generate endless angles as an excuse to never commit to one of them. The cure wasn't to think less. It was to do the thinking early, sharpen the blade long before the moment of the cut, and then trust the draw enough to let it happen in an instant, instead of a month. Kenji still visits the shop sometimes, though less often now. Sugimoto still sharpens knives at the same low table, still says little, still watches everything. The apartment worked out fine. Aya moved in that autumn. The vendor contract closed, and Fujita put him forward for promotion that spring, saying flatly that the man she was recommending hadn't existed a year earlier. Kenji hadn't become a different person overnight. He had simply stopped confusing thoroughness with paralysis, written down what he actually valued, and given himself 60 seconds, an hour, or a day, instead of however long fear demanded. If you're circling a decision right now, the method is simple. Comfort was never the point. Write down what you actually value. 5 sentences you'd stand behind. Check every choice against them first. Set a limit. A minute for small decisions, an hour for medium ones, a day for large ones. And once you've made the cut, leave it made, and turn toward whatever comes next. A blade that hesitates cuts nothing clean. Neither does a life spent circling every choice. So tell me in the comments, what decision have you been standing in the doorway of, and what would it take to draw the blade this week? Subscribe for the next story, sharpen your edge before you need it, and when the moment comes, cut once.